The talk show host, Graham Lighton, walked onto the set feeling confident. He was known for being tough on his guests, pushing them into corners and making them uncomfortable. He believed he had the upper hand today. But Pam Bondi had no intention of letting him control the conversation. The studio lights were bright, almost blinding. They felt hotter than she expected. Pam had been on television plenty of times before. She had debated high-profile cases, stood in front of reporters, and handled tough questions. But today felt different. There was a tension in the air, a quiet feeling that something was about to happen. Even before a single word was spoken, she could sense the energy in the room. She adjusted her blazer and sat up straight. Across from her sat Graham, the host of the exchange. He was well-dressed and had a reputation for pushing people to their limits. He was famous for his aggressive questioning, refusing to back down, and turning interviews into public interrogations. Pam had been invited to talk about law, justice, and her time as Florida's Attorney General. But the moment she walked onto the set, she knew that wasn't really the plan. The energy in the room felt off, cold and expectant, like the audience was waiting for a fight. She glanced at the crowd. Some people leaned forward, curious. Others sat with their arms crossed, skeptical. A producer counted down from 3. The red light on the camera flickered on. Graham leaned in with a practiced smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Pam, welcome to the exchange." She gave a polite nod. "Thank you for having me." His fingers tapped lightly on the desk. His voice was smooth, but there was an edge to it. "You've been at the center of controversy for quite some time. Your time as Attorney General, your political decisions, some people say you made choices that hurt more people than they helped. Would you say that's fair?" There it was. No warm-up, no easing into the discussion. A direct, pointed question right from the start. Pam had dealt with this kind of thing before, but something about Graham's tone made it clear he wasn't looking for a real conversation. He wanted a confrontation. She knew the audience noticed it too, but she didn't let it show. She kept her face calm. "I'd say that's an oversimplification of years of work," she said smoothly. "But if you'd like to discuss specifics, I'm happy to." Graham smirked and tilted his head slightly. "Oh, we'll get to specifics," he said, turning to the camera as if speaking directly to the audience. "But let's start with something simple. A lot of people, especially those affected by your policies, feel like you're out of touch with everyday Americans. That you put your own political gains ahead of what's right. Do you ever stop to think about the people on the other side of your decisions?" It wasn't a real question. It was bait. Pam knew better than to take it. She folded her hands neatly on the desk. "Every decision I've made was about upholding the law and protecting citizens," she said. "That doesn't mean everyone agrees with me. But leadership isn't about being liked. It's about doing what's necessary, even when it's unpopular." Graham let out a small chuckle, shaking his head. "That's convenient. But let's be honest, Pam." He leaned in, lowering his voice slightly. "Some would say you turned a blind eye to justice when it suited you." The room felt smaller. The audience was completely silent now, hanging on every word. Pam didn't react. She had seen this tactic before, forcing an emotional response, making the guests defensive, getting them flustered. But she wouldn't give him the satisfaction. Instead, she took a slow breath and met his gaze. "You seem eager to make this personal, Graham," she said. "I hope you'll let me answer your questions instead of just throwing accusations." The audience murmured. Graham's expression flickered for just a second, but he wasn't finished. He was about to take things even further. He leaned back, crossing his legs. "Pam, let's talk about power," he said smoothly. "Politicians, prosecutors, you all claim to serve justice. but it seems like justice often bends for those who already have influence. Pam stayed firm, waiting. She could sense where this was going. For example, Graham continued, his tone sharpening, when you were Attorney General, there were claims that corporate donors received special treatment. Investigations quietly disappeared. Powerful people walked away untouched. Can you look this audience in the eye and say that never happened? A trap. Cleverly worded. A denial would make her seem dishonest. An admission would be twisted against her. Pam exhaled slowly. Graham, if you're going to make accusations, at least be specific. What cases are you referring to? Graham smirked and turned to the camera. Oh, we'll get specific. Don't worry. The audience chuckled, but it wasn't. Light-hearted. It was the kind of laughter that expected a takedown. Pam could feel the energy shifting. Graham was painting her as someone under pressure, someone scrambling. But in reality, she hadn't even begun to push back. He flipped through a stack of papers. Whether he actually needed them was irrelevant. They were props, designed to make it look like he had some damning evidence. Let's start with this, he said dramatically. Back when you were in office, there was a lawsuit against a corporation, one of your donors accused of fraud. And then, suddenly, that lawsuit vanished. What a coincidence. Pam pressed her lips together. Now she knew exactly what he was referring to and how he was twisting it. She started to respond, but he cut her off. Tell me, Pam, he said. Why should the American people believe that people like you don't just protect the wealthy while the rest of us get left behind? A loaded question. The audience murmured. Graham thought he had her, but he underestimated her. Pam let the silence hang for a moment. Then she leaned forward slightly. You know, Graham, it's interesting how you frame things, she said. He blinked. Just barely. But she caught it. You make it sound like a scandal, she continued. In reality, the case was fully investigated. The claims didn't hold up. No cover-ups, no backroom deals. Just the legal process working as it should. But that wouldn't make for a very exciting headline, would it? The audience shifted. She could hear whispers. The weight in the room had started to shift. But Graham wasn't done. He had one last card to play. He leaned in, voice casual now. Let's put politics aside, he said. Let's talk about character. You've built a reputation as a tough prosecutor, a woman who stands by her principles. But what happens when those principles only seem to apply when it's convenient? Pam didn't react. She knew exactly where this was going. You remember the protests outside that theater in Tampa? He asked. Pam's jaw tightened slightly, but her voice stayed calm. Yes, I remember. Graham's smirk widened. He thought he had her, but she didn't flinch. She met his eyes. Graham, are you suggesting I should have stood there and taken harassment? That physical assault is justified? For the first time, Graham hesitated. The audience murmured. Pam leaned back. Let's not twist events for drama. If you want to have a real conversation, let's do that. But I won't entertain nonsense. And with that, the balance in the room shifted completely. Graham took a deep breath, flipping through his notes. The energy in the room had shifted. This wasn't just resistance from Pam, she was taking control. But Graham wasn't going to let that happen without a fight. And so, he made his second mistake. He inhaled sharply, glancing at his notes as if he needed to reset. The cracks in his confidence were small, but they were there. He wasn't used to losing control of an interview. Meanwhile, Pam remained steady, watching and waiting. She was ready. Graham wasn't giving up. If a personal attack hadn't rattled her, he'd go for something bigger. He set his papers down. laced his fingers together, and gave her a look that almost seemed pitying. "All right, let's be honest, Pam. You have a history of defending people and policies that many Americans most actually find problematic. If you weren't in politics, if you didn't have power, do you really think you'd be standing here today? Or would you be just another person left behind by the system you've supported?" It was a calculated move, meant to make her look privileged and disconnected from everyday struggles. But Pam saw right through it. She tilted her head slightly. "That's an interesting argument, Graham. You're saying that because I've worked within the system, I don't understand it?" Graham smirked, sensing an opening. "I'm saying you benefited from it." Pam leaned forward. "You seem to have a lot of opinions about my past, so let me ask you something. How do you define justice?" Graham's smile faltered. "Excuse me." She gestured toward him. "You're implying corruption, favoritism, that I got to where I am because of privilege. So, tell me, how do you define justice? Is it about who shouts the loudest? Who makes the most accusations? Or is it about facts?" Graham hesitated, searching for a response. Pam didn't give him a chance. "Because, Graham, if you're so sure the system is broken, I'd love to hear your solution. You've spent plenty of time criticizing me. What exactly would you do differently?" Silence. A murmur rippled through the audience. Graham's fingers curled slightly against the desk. "That's not my job, Pam." She nodded. "Exactly. Your job is to stir controversy, to frame things in a way that makes people think there's always a scandal, always a conspiracy. But let's be real, you don't actually care about justice. You care about creating a spectacle." The audience reacted. Immediately, some gasped, others murmured in approval. Graham blinked, his composure slipping. For the first time, Pam sat back. "So, if we're done playing games, I'd love to actually discuss the issues. But if you just want sound bites, let me know. I'd hate to waste your time." The tension in the studio was thick. For the first time since the interview began, Graham looked caught off guard. He hadn't planned for this. He hadn't expected her to take control so easily. He glanced at the camera, then back at Pam, exhaling through his nose. "All right," he said, his voice noticeably tighter. "Let's talk about the issues." But the audience could tell he wasn't in control anymore. Graham's fingers drummed lightly against the desk as he tried to regain his footing. He was supposed to be steering the conversation, keeping his guest on the defensive. But somehow, Pam had flipped the script. Forced a smile, though it was stiffer than before. "All right, Pam, you want to talk about facts? Let's talk about facts." Pam nodded, waiting. Graham flipped through his notes again, but it felt more like a stalling tactic. "You've been involved in the legal system for years, prosecutor, attorney general, consultant. A lot of power, a lot of influence. And yet, every time controversy arises, you always seem to come out clean. Some people might find that suspicious." Pam raised an eyebrow. "Are you accusing me of something?" Graham spread his hands. "I'm saying the average person doesn't have that luxury. When they get caught up in the legal system, they don't just walk away." Pam's expression remained steady. "The law isn't about luxury, Graham. It's about understanding how it works and navigating it that applies to everyone, including me." Graham smirked again, but it was weaker this time. "That's easy to say when you have resources." Pam exhaled slowly. "You're right. Not everyone has the same resources. That's why understanding the law is so important. That's why due process exists. That's why cases shouldn't be judged based on public outrage or headlines." Graham opened his mouth, but Pam wasn't finished. "In fact, that's exactly what's happening right now, isn't it? You're not interested in facts. You're trying to paint me as some privileged elite who avoids accountability." But you have no proof. No case, just vague accusations designed to stir the pot. The audience murmured again. The shift was undeniable. Graham clenched his jaw slightly. He was losing them, and he knew it. Pam tilted her head. So, tell me, Graham, what do you actually want from this conversation? Do you want to discuss real issues, or are we just here to entertain the people at home with a one-sided spectacle? Graham inhaled sharply, shifting in his seat. I think the people at home want transparency. Pam nodded. Great. Then let's be transparent. Let's talk about why you keep interrupting me, why you frame things a certain way, why instead of discussing policy you prefer to throw out accusations without evidence. More murmurs. Some audience members nodded. Pam continued. Because, Graham, if you actually wanted a real discussion, you wouldn't be doing this. Graham forced a laugh. I'm just asking tough questions, Pam. She gave him a knowing smile. No, you're trying to create a headline. Silence. Graham glanced at the producer, looking for an escape. But there wasn't one. The room was no longer on his side. It was on hers. Then, from the back of the audience, someone started clapping. First one person, then another, then another. The applause spread through the room. It wasn't a loud standing ovation, but it didn't need to be, because in that moment, it was clear who had won. Graham swallowed and straightened his papers, just to keep his hands busy. The interview wasn't over, but it might as well have been. Pam had taken control. Graham cleared his throat, forcing a tight-lipped smile as the applause died down. His grip on the conversation was gone, and he wasn't getting it back. Pam remained composed. No gloating. No smirking. She had made her point, and the audience had seen it for themselves. Graham tried to wrap things up smoothly. Well, Pam, you've certainly made an impression today. She met his gaze. I tend to do that. A flicker of irritation crossed his face, but he hid it quickly. He needed to end this cleanly. Well, he said, shifting his papers, I think that's all the time we have. I appreciate you coming on. Pam nodded. I appreciate the opportunity. Maybe next time we can have an actual discussion instead of a performance. The audience chuckled. Graham forced a smile but didn't reply. He turned to the camera, his voice slightly tighter than before. That was Pam Bondi, former Attorney General of Florida. We'll be right back after this. As soon as the cameras turned off, Graham sighed, rubbing his forehead. Pam stood, adjusting her blazer. She turned to him and said, If you ever want a real conversation, let me know. He scoffed. I ask the questions people want answered. Pam smiled. No, you ask the questions that get clicks? And with that, she walked off the set.